December 1944. Elite German Panzer commander Hans Müller thought his crew was invincible until American tank destroyers outmaneuvered and captured them in minutes, shattering everything he believed about German military superiority. But what happened next in the American POW camp would destroy his faith in Nazi ideology even more completely than losing the tank battle. How do you rebuild your entire worldview when the enemy you were taught to hate treats you better than your own government ever did?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 16th, 1944. The snow fell thick and heavy across the Belgian countryside, turning the rolling hills into a white blanket that muffled all sound. In the distance, church bells from small villages rang out across the frozen landscape, their gentle chimes mixing with something far more sinister: the deep rumble of tank engines warming up in the pre-dawn darkness. Hans Müller pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he stood next to his Panzer IV tank. At 38 years old, he had spent 3 brutal years fighting on the Russian front, where he learned that survival meant being faster and smarter than the enemy. His weathered face showed the marks of countless battles, and his gray eyes held the steady calm of a man who had seen death many times and walked away. Müller was proud of his crew and his machine. The Panzer IV weighed 25 tons of German steel, with armor thick enough to stop most enemy shells, and a gun that could punch holes through American tanks at over a mile away. His crew was young but eager. Klaus, the driver, was only 19 but could make their tank dance across any terrain. Fritz, the gunner, had the best aim in the company and could hit a target the size of a dinner plate at 800 yards. Werner, the loader, was fast and strong, able to slam a shell into the gun's chamber in under 4 seconds. These boys looked up to Müller like a father, and he felt responsible for bringing them home alive. The German High Command had big plans for this day. They called it the last great push that would split the American and British armies in half and force them to make peace. Müller had heard these grand promises before, but something felt different this time. Back in Germany, his wife's letters spoke of empty store shelves and long lines for bread. His children asked for things he could not send them. The homeland was running out of everything: fuel, food, steel, and hope. But here in Belgium, the German army was making one final gamble. Hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers were about to crash through the American lines like a steel hammer. As the sun began to rise, painting the snow-covered trees in shades of pink and gold, Müller climbed into his tank's commander position. The inside of the Panzer smelled like oil, gunpowder, and unwashed men. The metal walls were cold enough to freeze skin on contact, and every breath came out as white vapor in the frigid air. He put on his leather helmet and checked his radio one more time. Static crackled through his headphones, mixed with the voices of other tank commanders reporting their positions. Klaus started the engine, and the powerful motor roared to life, sending vibrations through the entire machine. Black smoke poured from the exhaust, and the smell of burning diesel fuel filled the air. Müller gave the order to move forward, and they rolled out with dozens of other tanks, creating a line of steel beasts that stretched across the snowy field for over 2 miles. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They crashed through the thin American front lines, scattering enemy soldiers who seemed shocked and confused by the sudden attack. Müller began to think his commanders might be right about American weakness. His radio crackled with excited reports from other tank crews. They were winning. They were pushing the Americans back just like the old days in France and Poland. But then something changed. Mueller noticed movement in the tree line to his right, fast movement that didn't match the slow, steady advance of tanks. Through his periscope, he caught glimpses of American vehicles racing between the trees at speeds that seemed impossible. These weren't the heavy Sherman tanks he expected to fight. These machines looked different. Lower, faster, with bigger guns mounted on open platforms. Klaus shouted over the engine noise that he was seeing the same thing on the left side. American tank destroyers were moving around them like hunting wolves, using speed and surprise instead of heavy armor. Mueller had never seen anything like it. These American machines could go 35 miles per hour across rough ground, almost twice as fast as his Panzer. They would appear from behind a hill, fire a single shot, then disappear before his gunner could even turn the turret to face them. The first shell that hit them came from nowhere. The impact rang through the tank like a giant bell, and sparks flew from damaged equipment inside. Mueller's ears were ringing, but he could hear Klaus screaming that the tracks were hit. They were stuck, unable to move, sitting like a metal target in the middle of an open field. More American tank destroyers appeared from 3 different directions, surrounding them completely. Mueller realized with growing horror that these Americans had planned this trap perfectly. They had used his own confidence against him, letting the German tanks advance into a killing zone where speed and mobility mattered more than thick armor and big guns.
The second shell punched through their side armor like it was made of paper, filling the inside of the tank with hot metal fragments and choking smoke. Fritz was wounded and bleeding from his shoulder. Werner was unconscious. Klaus was crying for his mother. Mueller knew they had seconds before the next shot would kill them all. He made the hardest decision of his military career, reaching for the white flag that every tank commander carried but hoped never to use. The white cloth fluttered in the cold December wind as Mueller climbed out of his smoking tank with his hands raised high above his head. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the crackling flames that were starting to eat through the engine compartment. Fritz stumbled out behind him, blood still flowing from the metal fragment that had cut deep into his shoulder. Klaus helped Werner, who was awake now but dizzy and confused from hitting his head when the shell exploded inside their tank. The first American soldier Mueller saw was barely 20 years old, with a round baby face covered in dirt and a helmet that looked too big for his head. Mueller expected to see hate in the young man's eyes, maybe anger or the cruel satisfaction of victory. Instead, the American soldier looked worried and kept glancing at Fritz's bleeding wound. He spoke in broken German, asking if they needed medical help. Mueller could not believe what he was hearing. This enemy soldier was offering to help the men who had been trying to kill him just minutes ago. More American soldiers appeared, and Mueller braced himself for the beatings and torture that Nazi officers had told him to expect if he was ever captured. The propaganda films back in Germany showed Americans as savage criminals who would shoot prisoners or leave them to die in the snow. But instead of violence, the Americans brought a green canvas bag filled with medical supplies. A soldier who looked like he might be a doctor cleaned Fritz's wound with gentle hands and wrapped it in clean white bandages that smelled like soap and medicine. Then came the coffee. A young American private walked up with a metal cup that steamed in the cold air and handed it to Mueller without saying a word. The liquid inside was hot and black and bitter, but it warmed Mueller's frozen hands and sent heat all the way down to his stomach. He had not tasted real coffee in over 6 months. Back in Germany, they were making coffee from burned grain and tree bark because there were no coffee beans left in the entire country. But here, these American soldiers were sharing their coffee with German prisoners like it was nothing special. Klaus whispered that one of the Americans had given him a chocolate bar. Werner was chewing on something that looked like candy, but made crackling sounds between his teeth. Mueller watched his young crew members eat American food with wide eyes full of wonder and confusion. These were supposed to be their enemies, but they were acting more like concerned neighbors helping after an accident. The truck ride to the prisoner camp took 3 hours through the Belgian countryside, and Mueller spent every minute staring out the back canvas opening in complete shock.
The road behind them stretched like a river of American military power that seemed to go on forever. Trucks loaded with fuel barrels, food supplies, ammunition boxes, and spare parts rolled past in an endless line. Mueller tried to count them, but gave up after reaching 200 vehicles. Each truck was bigger and newer than anything he had seen in the German army. The Americans had so many supplies that some trucks were only half full, with space left over for things that were not even needed for fighting. A convoy of tank transporters rumbled past, each one carrying a brand new Sherman tank that gleamed with fresh paint and oil. Mueller counted 18 tanks on transporters, and the American soldiers sitting next to him said this was just one small supply run that happened every day. Every single day, the Americans moved enough equipment to supply an entire German division for a month. Mueller began to understand that Germany was not losing this war because American soldiers were better fighters. Germany was losing because America could build tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The prisoner camp appeared ahead like a small city made of wooden buildings and wire fences. But as their truck passed through the main gate, Mueller saw things that made his mind struggle to understand what his eyes were showing him. Prisoners were walking around freely inside the fence, talking in small groups, some even laughing at jokes. They looked healthy and well-fed, with clean clothes and solid shoes on their feet. These men did not look like prisoners at all. They looked better than most German soldiers he had seen in the last year of fighting.
The smell hit him first when they walked past the camp kitchen. Fresh bread baking in ovens, meat cooking on grills, vegetables boiling in huge metal pots that could feed hundreds of men. Mueller's stomach made loud noises that embarrassed him, but he could not help it. The smells reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen when he was a child, before the war changed everything. A German prisoner working in the kitchen waved at them through the window and held up a thick slice of white bread covered in real butter. Real butter, not the gray substitute they made from coal tar back home. An American officer showed them to their sleeping building, which had wooden bunks with actual mattresses and clean wool blankets. Each man got his own space, his own pillow, and a metal box where he could keep personal things. The building had electric lights that worked when you flipped a switch, and windows with real glass that let in sunlight, but kept out the cold wind. Mueller had not slept in a building this comfortable since before the war started. That evening, Red Cross packages arrived in a green truck driven by a smiling American woman who spoke perfect German. She handed out packages that contained canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, and small bottles of medicine. Mueller held his package and felt its weight in his hands, trying to understand how America could afford to give away more food to German prisoners than most German families saw in a month. Something was very wrong with everything his government had told him about this war. Christmas Eve 1944 arrived with snow falling softly outside the camp windows, each flake catching the light from the electric bulbs that lined the main walking paths. Mueller had been a prisoner for 8 days now, and each day brought new confusion that made his head hurt when he tried to think about it too much. He sat on his bunk writing a letter to his wife on paper the Americans had given him, trying to find words to explain things that made no sense. How could he tell her that the American guards had given every German prisoner a warm winter coat when his own army had sent him into battle wearing a summer uniform? How could he explain that the camp library had more books than the entire town where he grew up, and prisoners were allowed to read anything they wanted, even books that criticized the American government? His wife would think he was lying, or that the Americans had somehow damaged his mind.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life, and an American officer spoke in careful German, inviting all prisoners to join a special Christmas celebration in the main dining hall. Mueller had heard rumors about this feast from prisoners who had been here longer, but he did not believe the stories. No army would waste that much food on enemy prisoners. But Klaus and Fritz were already putting on their coats, excited like children on their way to a birthday party. The dining hall was decorated with green pine branches and red ribbons that the Americans had somehow found in the middle of a war zone. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, each one covered with white cloth and set with real plates, metal forks, and glass cups that sparkled under the bright lights. The smell that filled the air made Mueller close his eyes and remember Christmas dinners from before the war, when his mother would cook for 3 days to prepare a feast that fed their entire family. But this was bigger than any Christmas dinner he had ever seen. Whole roasted turkeys sat on silver platters, their golden skin crispy and perfect, surrounded by mounds of stuffing that smelled like herbs and butter. Bowls of mashed potatoes steamed next to plates of green vegetables that looked fresh and colorful. There were cranberry sauce that gleamed like red jewels, rolls that were still warm from the oven, and pies with crusts so perfect they looked like something from a picture book. Mueller stood frozen in the doorway, watching American officers serve German prisoners like honored guests at a restaurant. A young American captain filled Mueller's plate so high with food that some of it spilled over the edges. The man smiled and wished him a Merry Christmas in German that he had clearly practiced many times. Mueller wanted to ask why they were doing this, why they were treating enemies better than Germany treated its own people. But his voice would not work. The turkey was tender and juicy, falling apart when he touched it with his fork. The potatoes were smooth and rich with butter and cream. The vegetables tasted like they had been picked from a garden that morning, not like the canned substitutes they ate in Germany. But the most shocking thing was the coffee. Real coffee, black and strong and hot, served in cups that the Americans kept filling every time they got empty. Mueller drank 4 cups and still could not believe it was real. After dinner, an American soldier wheeled in a movie projector and set up a white screen at the front of the room. The film began with images of American factories, but these were not like any factories Mueller had ever seen. Workers stood at assembly lines that stretched for hundreds of yards, building tanks and airplanes and trucks faster than seemed possible. The narrator explained that one Ford factory could build a new bomber every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mueller did his math and realized that a single factory could build more planes in 1 month than Germany had built in the entire war. The next film showed American cities with streets full of cars, stores full of food, and houses with electric lights in every room. Children played in parks with green grass and clean water fountains. Women wore new dresses and carried purses made of real leather. Men walked to work in suits and ties, carrying lunchboxes filled with meat sandwiches and fresh fruit. This was not a country at war. This was a country so rich and powerful that fighting Germany was just a small job they were doing on the side. But the film that broke something inside Mueller's mind showed places he recognized but could not understand. The camera moved through camps that looked like cities, but the people living there were thin and sick and dying. The narrator spoke in German about places called Buchenwald and Dachau, about gas chambers and ovens built to kill human beings like they were nothing more than insects. Mueller had heard whispers about these places, but he had always believed they were just enemy lies meant to make German soldiers feel bad about fighting. The faces on the screen looked real. The bodies stacked like wood looked real. The American soldiers who found these places looked sick and angry and sad in ways that could not be faked. Mueller watched German guards being arrested by American soldiers who treated them more gently than those same guards had treated the prisoners they were supposed to protect. When the films ended, the dining hall was completely quiet, except for the sound of grown men crying. Mueller felt tears on his own face, but could not remember when they had started. Everything he had believed about his country, his government, and his cause crumbled like a house made of sand being washed away by ocean waves. He had been fighting for people who built factories to kill innocent families while calling themselves the master race. He had been proud to serve leaders who starved their own people while claiming they were making Germany great again. That night, Mueller lay on his comfortable bed under his warm blanket, staring at the ceiling and trying to rebuild his understanding of the world. The Americans had not just defeated Germany with better tanks and more supplies, they had defeated Germany by being everything Germany claimed to be, but was not. May 15th, 1946. The train wheels clicked against the metal tracks in a steady rhythm that had been putting passengers to sleep for the past 12 hours, but Mueller could not close his eyes. Through the dirty window, he watched the German countryside roll past like scenes from a nightmare he was trying to forget. Broken bridges stood half-collapsed over empty rivers. Burned-out tanks rusted in fields where nothing grew except weeds and wild grass. Villages that once had red tile roofs and white-painted walls now looked like piles of broken stones scattered by some angry giant. Mueller carried everything he owned in a small canvas bag that the Americans had given him when they released him from the prison camp. Inside were 2 changes of clothes, a bar of soap that still smelled like the camp laundry, 3 chocolate bars he was saving for his children, and a letter of recommendation written by the American camp commander. The letter said that Hans Mueller was a man of honor who had learned important lessons about democracy and freedom during his time as a prisoner of war. But the most important thing Mueller carried could not fit in any bag. In his mind, he held 18 months of memories that had completely changed how he saw the world. He remembered the taste of real coffee and the feeling of sleeping under warm blankets every night. He remembered American soldiers sharing their food and medicine with men who had been trying to kill them just days before. He remembered films that showed him the truth about what his own government had done to innocent people while he was fighting what he thought was an honorable war. The train pulled into the station at Cologne just as the sun was setting, painting the ruins of the great cathedral in shades of gold and red. Mueller stepped onto the platform and breathed air that smelled like dust and smoke and sadness. Everywhere he looked, women in black dresses picked through piles of broken bricks, looking for anything useful they could find. Children with thin faces and old eyes begged passengers for food or cigarettes. Old men sat on pieces of concrete that used to be buildings, staring at nothing with empty expressions. Mueller walked through streets he had known since childhood, but now they looked like the surface of the moon. His family's neighborhood had been hit by bombing raids that left craters big enough to hide a truck. The house where he grew up was just a pile of rubble with one wall still standing, covered in black soot from fires that had burned out months ago. But somehow, his own small house had survived, with only broken windows and holes in the roof that his wife had covered with pieces of wood and metal she found in the ruins. His wife, Anna, opened the door before he could knock, and Mueller saw that she had aged 10 years in the 18 months he had been gone. Her face was thin and lined with worry, and her dress hung loose on a body that had not had enough food for too long. But her eyes were still bright with love, and when she wrapped her arms around him, he felt like he had finally come home to something real and true and worth protecting. His children, Emma and Carl, stood behind their mother like shy strangers meeting someone they had heard about but never seen. Emma was 8 now, with serious eyes that made her look older than her years. Carl was 5, small for his age, with arms and legs like thin sticks. Mueller knelt down and pulled out the chocolate bars, watching their faces light up with wonder as they tasted sweetness they had almost forgotten existed. That first dinner was bread made from sawdust and potatoes boiled in water with no salt or butter. Anna apologized for having so little to offer, but Mueller could barely eat because his throat kept closing up with emotions he could not name. Everything his family had lived through during the war made his time in the American prison camp look like a vacation at a fancy hotel. While he had been eating turkey dinners and sleeping in heated buildings, his wife and children had been cold and hungry and afraid every single day. In the weeks that followed, Mueller became known in his neighborhood as the man who told strange stories about America. People gathered in his small kitchen on Sunday evenings to hear him describe a country so rich that it gave away food to enemy prisoners, so powerful that it could fight wars on two sides of the world at the same time, and so confident in its beliefs that it allowed prisoners to read books that criticized the American government. Some people called him crazy or said the Americans had filled his head with lies, but others listened carefully and asked questions about this place where ordinary workers owned cars, and every child went to school, and nobody had to wait in line for bread. These were people who had lived through 12 years of Nazi promises about German superiority and had seen where those promises led. They were ready to hear about a different way of living and thinking about the world. Mueller started teaching English classes in the basement of a church that had lost its roof but still had solid walls. He used books and newspapers that American soldiers brought him, teaching German children and adults to speak the language of the country that had defeated them but then helped them rebuild. He told them that learning English was not about giving up being German. It was about becoming part of a bigger world where different countries could work together instead of trying to destroy each other. 20 years later, when his son Carl graduated from an American university and his daughter Emma married a young man who worked for the American government in West Berlin, Mueller would sit in his garden and remember that Christmas dinner in the prison camp. He would think about how the world had changed because one country had been strong enough to win a war and wise enough to treat his enemies with dignity and respect. On his deathbed in 1987, Mueller told his grandchildren the most important lesson he had learned as a prisoner of war. True strength was not about having the biggest army or the most powerful weapons. True strength came from building a society so good and fair and generous that even your enemies wanted to copy it. That was the real secret of American power, and it was a lesson Germany had finally learned by watching how winners should act when the fighting was over. October 1961. Mueller stood at the podium in the newly built German-American Friendship Center in Frankfurt, looking out at an audience that would have been impossible to imagine 20 years ago. American businessmen sat next to German factory workers. Former Wehrmacht soldiers shook hands with U.S. Army veterans. Young German students who'd grown up learning English in Mueller's classes translated for their grandparents who still remembered the old hatreds. The occasion was the opening of a new Ford factory that would employ 3,000 Germans and produce cars for both European and American markets. But for Mueller, now 55, with gray hair and lines around his eyes that came from smiling more than frowning, this ceremony represented something much bigger than jobs and money. It was proof that enemies could become partners when they shared the same values about human dignity and freedom. As the guest speaker, Mueller had been asked to tell his story one more time. He began with the familiar words about his Panzer crew being captured by American tank destroyers, but tonight he focused on something different. He talked about his son Carl, who now worked as an engineer for NASA, helping Americans reach for the moon with rockets designed by German scientists who had also learned the difference between destruction and creation. He spoke about his daughter Emma, who taught German literature at an American university, where students from 50 different countries learned together in the same classrooms. The most powerful moment came when Mueller introduced a special guest. Major Robert Thompson had been one of the young American officers who ran the prisoner camp where Mueller spent those crucial 18 months. Now a successful businessman from Detroit, Thompson had flown to Germany specifically for this ceremony. The two men embraced on stage while the audience stood and applauded, and Mueller realized that some of the people clapping had tears in their eyes. Thompson spoke about how the American Army's decision to treat German prisoners with respect had not been about being soft or weak. It had been about being strong enough to stick to American values even when fighting against people who had abandoned their own humanity. Those prison camps had not just held enemy soldiers. They had been schools where future German leaders learned what democracy actually looked like when it was practiced instead of just talked about. After the ceremony, Mueller walked through Frankfurt's rebuilt streets with his grandson Peter, a boy who spoke English as easily as German and dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Peter asked his grandfather if he ever regretted losing the war, and Mueller thought carefully before answering. He explained that Germany had not really lost a war in 1945. Germany had found itself again by learning from a country that was strong enough to win, but wise enough to share its strength with others. The greatest victory, Mueller told his grandson, was not conquering your enemies, but turning them into friends who wanted to build the same kind of world you believed in. That was the real lesson he had learned as a prisoner of war, and it was the reason why German children could now dream of reaching for the stars alongside the Americans who had once been shooting at their fathers. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.